Chapter 37. He stormed out through the front corridor, gratuitously scraping his claws against the time stone. It was so much nicer now that it was clean. In that moment, he hated it. Venomix burst out onto the landing and paused, flaring his wings and swiveling his neck about in momentary uncertainty. Not that there was anything out here to confuse him, but he just had no idea what to do next. He could just leave, actually leave. He was old enough. It was probably about time anyway. Just take off, pick a direction and keep going until something worth settling into caught his eye. North, perhaps. He could go all the way to the other end of the Evervilles and find a lair. With the Traximos gone, it was likely the others wouldn't even bother to contest his claim as long as it wasn't too close. But if he did that, if he actually left. His eyes fell on the two ghosts standing guard at either side of the entrance to his home. Snarling, he lunged forward, lashing out with a claw at the Phantom Legionary stationed to the left of the door. It evaded him without effort, dissolving into mist and then reforming right where it had been. Still at attention. Seemingly ignoring him. In pure frustration, he exhaled a blast of fire at the specter. It didn't bother reacting to that at all. A second later it was standing untouched in a large scorch mark. Oi oi oi! Leave him alone, why big bully, they are not bothering you. She came bounding out of the door, energetic as always, and to Venomix's utter fury actually spoke to the ghosts. Sorry, guys, he's just... well, you've met him. When a lad's at a certain age, you know how it is. Venomix hissed at her. She didn't even have the decency to snarl back, just grinning. Don't take it out on me, either. I won't stand there and ignore it like a ghost. What the hells was today's entire production about, Venomax? You're cruising to end up like a Traximos did if you keep finding all the worst possible strings to pull. You just leave me be. I'm in no mood for any of your nonsense today, Vedarelshi. Ah, yes. Your life is so hard, she said solemnly. You have so many problems that you didn't create all by yourself for no discernible reason. He roared in fury and snapped at her throat. Vedarelshi whipped her neck in an adroit move that both evaded the bite and then headbutted his nose on the rebound, sending him reeling backward. Snarling, Venomix planted his rear claws against the time-stone balustrade behind him and beat both wings at her furiously, creating a gust that caught her own spread wings and shoved her backward. She parried his next two bites with swipes of her furry claws, and then when he retreated a few steps, spun around to swipe at him with her tail. Venomix hopped nimbly over it, which she had apparently anticipated, as she redirected the movement halfway through, whipping her tail upward to slap him hard right on his exposed underbelly. He was sent wheeling backward, toppled fully over the balustrade, and tumbled down the mountain with a humiliating lack of dignity. Humiliating and enraging. Venomix caught himself mid-slide, shoving himself off the side of the mountain and spreading his wings to turn his tumble into a glide. Beating them furiously, he shot back upward, exhaling a blast of fire across the landing. She wasn't there. Vedarelshi had already moved, now clinging to the stone face of the mountain peak above the Temestial doorway, and launched herself bodily at him from above. The impact sent them both into a graceless tumble. The pair spun into space, roaring and clawing at each other as they plummeted toward the forest below. By the time they separated, with a mutual thrash of all 8 talons pushing them apart, both of them grazed the treetops as they swerved to glide away from each other. Venomix beat his wings furiously, shooting upward to regain altitude and visibility. Knowing his patterns by now, Vedarelshi had zipped away into nearly horizontal flight to put maximum distance between them. But he was faster than she in the air, always had been, even if not by a lot. He arsed down at her, exhaling a long blast of fire just in advance of her course. She banked abruptly, evading the burst by a hair, then beat her wings and shot upward and back, right at him. Not even turning around to attack properly, simply propelling herself back first in his direction in an attempted body slam. Venomax was forced to break off his exhalation and try to veer away, only for her to pivot in midair, taking advantage of his momentary confusion to come at him with all claws again. They engaged in the air, roaring, slashing, and snapping, then parted. He sprayed another blast of fire at her, but as usual she preferred to attack physically, swooping to intercept him and sending them in another clawing tumble through the sky before they were forced to disengage and part to regain altitude. And then the same, again and again, while below them the forest burned. Wow! Look at them go at it! Mirette was the only one fascinated enough to stand fully upright to watch the spectacle, at least until Hans physically seized her by the legs and pulled her down into the shelter of the boulders behind which the rest of the party was hunching. That cost her a few moments of the show, until she regained her feet and peeked over the rocks with more circumspection alongside her comrades. The dragons were still dueling in the air above Dragonvale, swooping in white arcs, during which the red one sprayed bursts of fire half the time, while the slightly smaller green just kept charging right at him to engage with claw and fang. Roaring filled the sky, echoing off the surrounding mountains, accompanied by the periodic bone-shaking impacts as they came together again and again. They'd snap and snarl in midair for a few seconds before swooping around to try again, or, sometimes, clawing so fiercely they got caught in a tangle and fell almost to the tree level before pushing apart and gliding away to recover their altitude before trying again. By now the forest in the valley was burning in 3 places, at least, 3 big enough to catch and begin to spread. Anybody actually seen them light into each other like this? Mirette asked, eyes still fixed on the show. I don't have any context for what I'm seeing. Is this a playful scuffle, a murder attempt? Somewhere in between? It's a good reason for us to get the hells out of here, is what Nimirda hissed. The dragons haven't fought each other in public for a long time, that I'm aware of, Hans murmured. There'll be more thorough records back at the guild. And? Which ones are these? Mirette asked. He shook his head. The red and black one is hostile. He's marked firmly as a void. You really should know that, boss. It's a standard warning for every guild in the Vales. He's not aggressive like his papa but doesn't like being approached. The green one is. Vanda. He shook his head again with an irritated expression. Well, it'll be written down in the guild records. She used to sometimes talk to people, but not for decades. Vedawashi, Mayasha corrected, patting him on the back. Hans sighed in annoyance, ignoring her. Friendly? Not for years. Decades, like I said. The green and blue ones just fly away if people get close. The red one'll sometimes spit fire at you first. Job's cooked, boss, Nimirda said tersely, gesturing down at the forest spread out below them, which was now burning hard enough in multiple places that the roar of the conflagration was beginning to compete with the dragon's noise. They were high enough that the sharp mountain winds were still stealing the heat, but that might change any time now. Can't very well suppress bandits in that. Also, this is gonna kill them better than we ever could. She sighed, scowling. That was a nice waste of 2 weeks of hiking. Oh, look on the bright side, Mayasha cooed, now patting her shoulder. You need the exercise. The elf jerked away from her. Make one more crack about my weight, kitty, see what happens. Button it, Mirette ordered. Nim's right, bandit suppression is officially off the menu. But, we can still break even on this, maybe even pull out ahead. We're gonna stay put and observe until the dragons stop doing anything interesting. The guild's standard rate for intel on dragon movements will cover our expenses. And I've got a feeling this isn't the only out-of-character thing they've done lately. Remember how that red one came tearing through here just a bit ago? Hans, you're sure you didn't get a good look at what he was carrying? Couldn't even be certain he was carrying something, from that angle, the scout replied, shaking his head. He had one arm tucked up against his body. Could have just been hurt. Except he's using that arm now, Mayasha objected. Mirette nodded. Suggests to me he snatched something valuable, that someone will miss. If our report adds context to an ongoing investigation, you know what that'll mean. All three of her party members nodded, and hunkered down to watch the dragons in silence while the forest fire spread out before them. Not that they were blind to the danger, but they were professional adventurers after all, and this was the one thing that motivated them more than the call to adventure itself, the prospect of bonuses. It wasn't long at all before he'd had enough. Not that fighting wasn't fun. That was why they'd done so much of it over the years. Sometimes for hours at a stretch. It was a great way to get the blood up, to clear the mind, work off the inevitable stress that came from living in a Traximosa's shadow. But there was the other side of it, that she was just better. They were both holding back, of course, neither really wanting to do the other permanent injury. But even though she had never admitted it, Venomax was certain she was holding back more. She was just too adroit, too precise. Scrapping with her always left him with the lingering impression that if she really wanted, she could kill him. Mostly, that was just how things were. No point in taking it personally. He lived under the wings of multiple dragons for whom he was no match. At least with Phenerexa around, he wasn't the bottom-tier fighter in this family. Now, though, right now, it was really driving home exactly all the thoughts he didn't want to think. The feelings he didn't know how to deal with. Venomax wheeled away from her, pumping his wings to propel himself across the valley. Oh, quite a lot of it was on fire. His father would... Wait. No, he didn't have to worry about that, and never would again. It was going to take a lot more time to get used to. He selected a suitable ridge and settled onto it. Harder than necessary. His impact left claw craters in the ancient stone, quite a few shards breaking free to tumble down the slope into the valley below. She approached, too, at a more sedate pace. She beat her wings to soften her approach, and he wasn't sure whether it was a pointed contrast to his own landing or just signaling that she wasn't diving in to attack. Well, whatever. She settled lightly on the ridge a short distance away, and Venomax deliberately refused to think about all the subtle ways in which she liked to deliver mockery. "Feel better?" she asked. "No," he snapped. Then turned his head to stare across the valley, at the distant domestial doorway to their home. "A little." "Good. Seriously, though, Max. What in every unnamed hell were you thinking?" He heaved a deep sigh and lowered himself to settle on the flattest section of the ridge that was nearby. Scowling moodily down at the burning forest, he said nothing. "A princess. Really? I mean, not that it isn't iconic and all. Very literary, I'm sure you made Phenerex's whole week. But what the hells were you even gonna do with a princess?" "What one does with a captive human," he snarled, raising his head to glare down the length of his nose at her. "What they're good for. As a dragon should. Just as our mothers are apparently going to do with their new pet. Anyway." He turned his head away, scowling. "I didn't actually know she was a princess until Phenerexa said so. Someone important, certainly, maybe a duchess or something. She was at this big ceremony, up on the central part with a bunch of... She was pretty, and clearly significant. That was all." "Oh, so you crashed a ceremony," she commented, rolling her eyes. "That's gonna make some waves. The mortals will be good and riled for a while. Thanks for that." "Oh, please, what exactly are they going to do?" "You know we don't have the old bastard here to scare them off anymore. The whole idea was to make it as long as possible before they figure that out and start getting uppity. I wonder how much of our very little remaining peace and quiet you just toasted." "We never needed him." Venomax slammed his tail into the mountain face for emphasis. "You and I are far from nothing, even Phenerexa is still a dragon. And our mothers are capable of fending off any attack." "You know who doesn't think that? Our mothers. That kind of naive arrogance is what gets dragons killed, no matter how powerful they are. If only there was some recent and incredibly vivid example of that which happened right in front of our noses." He snorted, turning away from her. "Also, Daryl, she added more quietly, don't forget I actually know you. You, Venomax, do not have it in you to do to a mortal woman what some dragons have been known to. I frankly doubt you'd be able to rile yourself up enough even to try, and that's because if you somehow did, you'd take one look at her face right afterward and hate yourself for the rest of your eternal existence. Venomax hunched his neck, slumping over the ridge like a gargoyle to glare down at the burning forest. So, seriously, what did you think was gonna happen? I'm not Phenorixa, I know you aren't actually stupid. You surely knew Colin wouldn't allow you to keep a victim like that, and you were aware for an incontrovertible fact that Izairo would never tolerate it, and probably claw your ass into shreds for trying. Hells, you came home and announced it to the whole family. What's the big idea, Max? Are you just trying to make someone kill you? I think she came close. He refused to answer. Venomax, Daryl, she said insistently, and the sudden realization in her tone made him physically cringe. Did you do this for attention? That's right, laugh it up. He snarled, rounding on her and flaring his wings aggressively. Let's hear all your little jabs. I'm sure this'll be your masterpiece. Really take your time and make it all properly snippy. Bro. She switched to Hainerid, a language nowadays associated with scholarship and venerable history, which they favored in some conversations because its rigid tiers of formality enabled a level of vulgar familiarity for which no modern language had a counterpart. You shitting me right now? There's nothing wrong with loving and respecting your mother, or valuing the time you spent with her. I do with mine. Or resenting somebody for hogging her attention. I know our father would have sneered at it, but consider, our father was a ludicrous dickhead. In spite of himself and everything, Venomax had to smile, barely managing to repress a snort of amusement. And the whole world is better off now that he's gone out in a dissipating puff of his own stubbornness, starting with us, she continued. Look, man, I'm sympathetic, in fact I'll tend to agree that Izairo has been a bit out of line, monopolizing Colin's time to the point it's gonna start annoying the other two, not to mention neglecting you. Not that I would say that to her, she'd tear my wings off. But you? You should have. That conversation is not any less necessary now, and it's just gonna be that much worse now that you've meticulously planned and executed your stratagem to piss her off in the maximum way possible. I just don't. I don't know what anything is anymore, he said quietly. It was exactly the kind of statement he'd have delivered in a roar just minutes ago. He could still feel the frustration and confusion clawing at him from inside, but now, he was more tired than angry. Life wasn't exactly great before, but I knew how to live that way. What am I supposed to do, to think about this whole situation? This sniveling, smirking mortal who they all insist on treating like he is some kind of. Okay, you're not wrong to feel off-kilter about the huge change in our situation, we all do, but I gotta stop you there, brother. You'll only come to grief trying to make Colin the villain in this. He's actually a good dude. I'm taking it slow with him, but I really think you should try making friends. Venomax hissed at her. Daryl, she rolled her eyes and then flopped over on her side, sliding down the inner edge of the ridge until she came to rest against the mountain face. Give him a chance, Max. As mortals go, I think this one has a lot of the exact traits this family needs. Look how happy he makes your mother. And Emmy. And my mother, though she mostly just confuses him, which by the way is the most hilarious thing I've ever seen. I'm supposed to respect some human because he knows how to schmooze. He's a people person. Good at communicating and dealing with personal and interpersonal issues. Not saying the guy is perfect, even by mortal standards, I'm just saying. Things change. Life's a battle. You gotta flow with the blows or they'll break you. We're stuck with a silly little godling where our evil asshole father used to be, and there are upsides to this. I just think it'd be better to lean into the benefits than try to make it all as bad as possible. He heaved a sigh, staring out over the burning valley. You can't tell what they're talking about? Hans lowered his spyglass. I can barely read lips on those long faces, and I don't even know what language they're using. Nothing intelligible, sorry boss. Can't be helped. Moret patted his shoulder. At least we know now that was what passes for a friendly little scuffle. All of them flinched down as both dragons took flight, winging back across the burning valley. They banked widely, riding the updrafts from the fire below, but sailed right back to their lair without any more detours. I don't know about Findwe or Wit, said Maisha, but it wasn't Fasuius, at least. You and I used to fight like that. Like that? Nimarda raised an eyebrow. Yes, just like that. You also was few. Alright, Merit decided, standing up. We're pulling out, foxes. I want as many tracks between us and this mess as possible before we have to camp. Back to Boisford, with all haste. In fact, as soon as we hit the border station, I'm gonna shell out for a carriage back to the city. This intel will be worth more the fresher it is. Something is up with these dragons. Daryl, she went first, trotting down the entry corridor with her neck highly arched, looking pleased with herself. Vanamax didn't take that personally. That was just something she liked to do. He found himself hesitating at the entrance. The two ghosts were still there. Was it the same two, or? How could you even tell? About. He paused, shaking his head. In the interest of. Vanamax broke off, staring at them. They stared back, at attention. He couldn't be sure they even knew he was there. With a snort, he stalked between them, through the doorway. Seconds later, he had come to a halt, pivoted fully, and poked his head out. Sorry. Then he was off, stomping back into the lair to deal with whatever was about to happen next. It didn't promise to be anything good. Chapter 38. I'm glad you're gratified, Colin snapped. And yes, I am being glib, but also genuinely. However, I asked you a question to which I need an answer. Tiavathar's smile faded. He could feel the shifting torrent of emotion in her. And after a moment's consideration, deliberately backed away from that perception. Colin was willing to leverage his power when he needed to, and in dealing with beings who were phenomenally powerful in their own right and also shockingly immature at times, it inevitably transpired that he needed to, but he did not want it to become a crutch, or his default approach. So he retreated to give her the privacy of her own feelings, and waited for her to gather her thoughts. This was something deeply important, and he could not claim to respect her if he didn't let her determine how to address it. I have waited for such a long time, she finally said. Her voice was quiet, and her gaze distant, fixed on the wall at a point far above his head. I know the patterns of history. There is no such thing as an absolute power. Actions create reactions. The greater the exertion of force, the greater the ultimate backlash. When unassailable power rises, it sows the seeds of its own demise. The appearance of invincibility is only that. Nothing is indestructible, nor eternal. Tyrants and empires fall. There are no exceptions. So I waited. He also waited, now, while she paused to think. Still she was staring at nothing. Colin gave her time. And waited, Tiavatharas repeated quietly. She fell silent again, and after another moment, Colin tentatively opened himself to her, trying to control. Concentrating on limiting the amount of input, not to delve deep but just to get a sense. He felt more calm from her than before, as if the act of talking about this was helping her process it. Thus reassured, he withdrew again, letting her take her time. When the Traximos came upon me, I was at something of a low point, she said at last. What occurred next? Well, in human terms, I've no doubt you would consider it an atrocity. And rightly so, had the same transpired between two humans. As you get to know us as individuals, Colin, it's worth bearing in mind that for all that people are fundamentally similar in many ways, there are things about dragons which are different, on a deeper level than cultural difference can account for. I am explaining this to make the point that my grudge with the Traximos was not personal. Our relationship was. satisfactory. It was normal, for dragons. Each of us got what we expected, and wanted. She inhaled deeply, and for a second, Colin thought she was about to spit flame, but instead she slowly released the breath, her expression darkening. That is not to say I did not know what he was, nor what my place here made me complicit in. So I watched, and waited. T-Avatharis began to rise, uncoiling herself with a smooth, precise motion. I waited, and watched, because I knew that the longer his depredations carried on, the more certain his comeuppance became. Nor did I wait passively, Colin. I prepared. In the course of what are entirely ordinary hoarding activities for one such as myself, I was easily able to conceal my acquisition of a very specific set of armaments. Slowly and carefully, I acquired weapons and armor, rare tinctures and spell scrolls, charms and enchantments. An arsenal designed toward the singular purpose of destroying a dragon, one so specialized in self-protection that even ordinary anti-dragon measures would not suffice. The world is old enough that I doubt anything any of us does is truly original, but still, I suspect there have been few dragons willing to do what I did, for the very prosaic reason that a dragon who assembles a ready-made dragon-slaying kit risks having it used on them. I thought. Her huge chest expanded, then her shoulders rose once, wings briefly spreading in a shrug. Well, if that was how things ended, fair enough. No one is truly eternal, and I know the weight of my complicity here. She turned, one mincing step at a time, and began to pace in a circle around the very edge of her huge central sleeping training pad. For such an immense creature her movements were amazingly precise, almost delicate. What was more difficult was training my daughter. There is an art, a specific style and technique, to the close cooperation of mortals and dragons in battle. It was a challenge to achieve this without her father noticing, but Vedaralshi is trained to fight alongside mortal companions ranging from a solo hero to small parties. She knows how to fly to provide the best position for archers, mages, or armored vanguards either riding on her back or held in her claws. She has been coached in providing aerial support for ground units up to and including armies. Everything I could think of. She was never strong enough to face Atraximos herself. If I had not that strength, it could never be asked of one so much younger, but I made her ready to provide support, interference, and everything necessary to give the inevitable mortal champion the best chance they could hope for. She was growing more animated as she spoke and paced, now, baring teeth and increasingly lashing her tail as her agitation increasingly leaked out. Colin held his position and watched her. That angrily flicking tail was not approaching him, and he knew she was too controlled to strike him accidentally. It wouldn't matter even if she did. And so I waited. And waited. I watched, while in the first century, they came in waves. First armies, and then as those were depleted, parties. They stooped to attempting assassinations. Bit by bit, the efforts trailed off. The knowledge and strength and numbers of the Vale folk waned. I held my peace, trusting they would find a way. Because I have so often seen mortals prevail against preposterous odds. Because I know that all invincibility is illusion, that in the end all that would be necessary was for one contender to get the right lucky hit. T-Avatharis growled, scraping her claws against the invulnerable time stone next to her own less enduring construction. I waited, and watched. And they kept growing. Thinner, and weaker, and more infrequent. I began assembling my arsenal. I could not risk Atraximos' attention by seeking out or actively courting hostile mortals. All I needed was for an individual or party to contest him and survive, to show the resilience or cleverness or luck to keep trying after a defeat. But the very few who lived to tell the tale. They only fled. In just the last century, when I had my Vedaralshi, I looked for someone who at least showed the promise. The skill and the will, the boldness just to poke around Dragonvale and seek an opportunity. She came to a stop, now glaring at the wall, wings half spread as if she were thinking of taking off. No one. Nothing. And they didn't. These latter-day kingdoms did not continue to fail, to grow weaker. No, they began to recover, to rebuild the strength their ancestors had squandered against Atraximos' scales. And instead of gathering for another strike, they... Trailing off, she stopped. Still she was gazing at nothing, but now her expression was not so much angry as haunted. "They adapted," Cullen said quietly. Tiavatharis closed her eyes, bent her neck to let her head hang. After a moment she opened her eyes again to gaze down on him. "You must have seen it, even as briefly as you were in Boisford. You are attuned to people, Cullen, and trained for civic administration. There is no way you didn't notice." "It's everywhere," he agreed. "In everything, every detail. From the culture to the architecture. They are discreet, surreptitious, fatalistic." "They won't fight," she said in a whisper powerful enough to ruffle his hair. "They gave up. Learned to live under the tyrant. That's what humans do. It's a great strength. Even if it wasn't the one you were looking for." She narrowed her eyes, but Cullen stared back without flinching. His instincts screamed against it, told him to assuage her feelings, agree with what she said and comfort her. But he knew that wasn't what she wanted. This was to be told the truth she didn't want to hear. To be stood up to. And again, after a pause, she lowered her gaze again, nodding. "It is. I remain cautious, wary of provoking Atraximos, but I am sure I could have done something more." His paranoia never waned. "I had little freedom to move without drawing his attention, but I am neither helpless nor inept. Surely there was some option I could have found, some means of seeking out or even cultivating the opposition I needed for him. But I did not. I trained my daughter, I prepared the support I could give to that increasingly hypothetical future hero, and I grew bitter. Frustrated. Even as I told myself it was unjust and irrational, I blamed these descendants of Valerald for not being the mortal companions I was so proud to have fought alongside, long ago." Her head rose, nose pointed at the ceiling, and for just a second she shivered in a brief, bitter laugh. "And then, you came. And now here we are. I'm husband." Tiavatharis snapped her head back down to gaze intently at him. "I want you to know that I hold no blame or bitterness toward you, none. On the contrary, you ended the reign of Atraximos the Dread in exactly the way it deserved to end, in an improbable, absurd repudiation of everything he was. You denied him even the dignity I would have given him, of a final struggle against the worthy foe. He was a beast and a monster, and he perished as a joke, and that is so much more fitting than anything I ever had the capability to arrange that I will never be able to show you enough gratitude for the vindication. You have done me no wrong even in the slightest, and there need be no tension between us over it." She lowered her head fully, until the tip of her nose bumped against him, sharply pointed in the context of her long face, but at her size sufficiently blunt that it didn't even poke him as she nuzzled ever so gently at his torso. Cullen reached up to caress her scales with a whole arm, and she closed her eyes. "No. There's no fault on your part. Only mine. That my preparations went for naught is just one of those ironies the world likes to throw at us. That I ended up accomplishing nothing toward his end is purely my own failure. And now..." Her lips drew back, baring fangs as long as his legs, close enough for him to touch, and yet Cullen felt no fear. "And now you want me to face them. Even just one of them. Every day, here in my own home. To look her in the eyes, knowing what I've done to generations of her people, what I failed to do even to mitigate my offense. I can't. Cullen, husband." And he understood, now, why she had been so inexplicably angry. It hadn't actually been anger, only the appearance of anger, a mask to protect herself from the real emotion. A mask even one as wise and noble as she had needed, for there was nothing more brutal to carry in one's heart than shame. "Change," Cullen ordered. The enormous dragon before him dissolved, and the woman who appeared in her stead would still have stood a head taller than he, had she not almost immediately crumpled. Cullen caught her before she could fall fully to her knees, wrapping her tightly in his arms. She clutched him for dear life, claws digging into his back as he cradled her head, burying her face against his neck. The muffled sound she made wasn't a sob, or a wail, or a groan, but some agonized hybrid for which his language didn't bother to have a word. Yet another way in which she was a challenge to all his habits. Colin's tool of choice had always been words, and he was good with them. He knew exactly the right things to say and every instinct he had wanted to say them. But he also knew that it was wrong, not here, not now, not with her. Instead, he did what she needed and held her. Tiavatharis clung to him. She wasn't crying, but there was labor in her every breath. Slowly he stroked her back, from between her horns to the middle of her spine, over and over. For long minutes, until some of the tension had gradually melted from her, and she was just holding him in return, not relying on him to stay upright. Only when time had passed, spent in simple warmth and sharing, did he speak. He knew she still did not respect words as much as actions and never would, but there were things here that needed to be said. "I can't judge you," Colin whispered. "I don't have the kind of training or education to render moral judgments on complex cases, and even if I did, I suspect this one would stymie me. I've no idea how to even begin tallying up all these actions and consequences, choices and mitigating factors and intentions. Not on that scale, over that time frame. It's just utterly beyond me." He stroked her hair one last time, then began gently to pull away. Not completely separating, but delivering a signal which she understood and acted on, pulling back in turn just enough that she could see his face, with their arms still around each other. Her green eyes had reddened, but she still hadn't wept. Having straightened up in the process, she was now looking down at him. "So I refuse to condemn you," Colin said quietly. "And by the same token, I can't offer you absolution. What I can do is be with you and support you. Your history is yours to live with, love. I'll be here to share the weight, but your shoulders are stronger than mine to begin with." She swelled slightly in his arms as she took a steadying breath, and then nodded. Colin shifted his grip so he could cup her face with one hand, gently stroking her cheek with his thumb. "I know you understand strategy, so here it is. Our material need is to stop Princess Percy from telling anyone in Boisvert about our situation. The option I'm leaning toward is keeping her here. The other two options are to kill her, or to send her to Rivkabit under formal diplomatic asylum, as she originally requested. I do not have to explain why the first one is not on the table." Tiavatharis nodded again, her face calmer now, gaze intent. "The second is problematic. The fact that Isaroa didn't even bring it up with me validates my hunch that it would breach the important separation she keeps between her role as absentee empress and her life here. Somewhat more relevant for our purposes, it would introduce complications in the form of other people Percy would be interacting with, every one of them an information risk. It would also create diplomatic problems between Rivak and Boisvert, and worst of all, create a trail of breadcrumbs leading anyone who's curious enough straight back here. Exactly the thing we don't want." "She's staying, then." Her voice was calm, now. "Accepting." "Almost certainly," Colin agreed. "I have to settle a few things with the others, but unless something incredibly surprising pops up in the next hour, that will be my decision. I understand, now, why having her here is going to be difficult for you." This was it. This was so hard. He wanted to soften the blow, to soothe her. Present everything in the best possible way. At this point he knew that it was the wrong thing to do and he knew why, but by every enumerated heaven he so wanted to. "And you're a big girl," Colin said firmly. "You need to suck it up." Her physical control was absolutely amazing. He couldn't have articulated or even identified any change in her posture, even in her expression. And yet, very suddenly, he found himself acutely aware that she was a veritable pillar of muscle and claws under that oh-so-pleasant feminine softness. "Believe me, I'm aware how ridiculously arrogant it is to compare my lived experience to yours," he continued, carefully keeping his tone even and firm but not aggressive, "but I'm about to anyway, so I'll just have to hope you forgive me. When I first snuck into this place, It was with the intention of getting my hands on something that would help me get even with those who have wronged me elsewhere. When you and the others first made me your offer to stay here, well, I certainly can't deny the immense appeal that had inherently, but there was a large part of me that was thinking that a horde and 3 dragon wives would be great assets to use against my enemies. And it is so weird to me to think that that was just a few days ago. Because sometime in the meantime, completely by accident, it's gotten through my head that none of that is worth doing. It's so much more important, so much better for me, personally, to be here, to focus on you. I mean, you, collectively, but also you in particular. Well, you know what I mean. That got him a smile, finally. And I have a feeling that's a lesson you fully absorbed long ago, Colin continued, smiling up at her in return. I know what it's like to get a painful thought lodged in your head and forget all about important things you already know. But it's still true, the past is written in stone. The path only goes forward. We'll have to make whatever peace we can with what's happened, and pay attention to what's in front of us. He shifted his hand, slowly stroking her cheek with the backs of his fingers. Then with the palm. After a moment, she let her eyes drift closed and leaned into his hand, like a caressed cat. He took time, a few rejuvenating seconds, to just share that little intimacy, because what he had to say next. So Percy is going to stay here, Colin said firmly, and you are going to look her in the eye and be kind to her. If she has any questions or accusations about what any of us have done in the past, about Atraximos or anything else, I will expect you above all the others to handle that with grace and compassion. I really do believe this is in your best interests as well, Tiavatharis, as a way forward. If it is not, consider it penance. Either way, this is how things need to be. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes, straightening her spine. Colin gently pulled back, giving her a bit more space. When her eyes opened, it was to the accompaniment of a small but warm smile. She bent herself forward in a deep nod that curved gently into a shallow bow. Very good, husband. As I have sworn, I belong to you and will obey your will. And, now that you have explained your thoughts, I believe your decision is the right one. Colin stepped forward again, reaching up to touch her face. Once more she leaned into his hand, but this time he slipped it around to cradle the back of her head again, pulling her forward and down. Tiavatharis tilted her face to receive a kiss, but instead, he pressed his forehead to hers and gently nuzzled at her in the draconic equivalent. A warm smile blossomed across her face and she reciprocated, gently moving her head in turn, rubbing her nose alongside his. You are. And this is very strange to me to realize. I think the best thing that could have happened to me. I don't just mean because you got rid of Atraximos for us. You were good for us, husband. For me. I will certainly do my best, Colin agreed. Let me support you, and I have faith that your strength can accomplish anything we need. This felt so very nice, but his responsibilities were not fully executed yet. After another indulgent moment, he pulled back, letting his hand fall. She reached out to lightly caress his own cheek with the backs of her claws, but otherwise allowed him to retreat. Now I have to go resume squaring away the details of expanding our very peculiar little family. I will be very much looking forward to spending more time with you when I'm free of immediate duties. Yes, husband, you do have duties to me, as well. For someone who disdained doublespeak and innuendo, she certainly didn't lack the ability. And I will look forward to hearing more about these enemies of yours. Oh. Crap. I think I would rather not, Colin said with great care. They are their own problem now, and I have better things to do. We'll see. Hells, he should not have said that. This was one of those accidental little slips that was going to have consequences, he could tell. After resolving to ignore the entity's advice and keep his wives out of his past, he had to go and involve the most warlike of the three, and with an inadvertently tantalizing little hint that would entice anyone to pursue it. This was what happened when he didn't get to plan and manage his conversations. Success in your endeavors, then, husband. And thank you for hearing me out, and knowing what to say. I appreciate you, Colin. He studied her face for a second, then smiled and decided on impulse to just tell her the simple truth, since she liked that so much. I love you, too. Colin greatly enjoyed her surprised expression in the last second before he turned and strode out of her lair, toward his next task. Chapter 39. Yes, that sounds fine, Imar said vaguely, waving a claw at him without looking up from her books. Colin had never seen enchanting being done before, and the spectacle was fascinating. She had one volume centered on a table, with the others waiting off to one side, and surrounding it was a veritable constellation of afterimages, glowing and translucent versions of different facets and surfaces of the book. Currently in her smaller form, the dragon was carefully moving them about with delicate swipes of her claws, as if... well, actually, he couldn't begin to guess at the mechanics of this. Colin cleared his throat after a moment. I apologize for even asking, but having known more than my share of people concentrating on books like that, I have to. Yes, husband, I am actually listening to you. She glanced up, fleetingly, her expression both amused and a little irked. I am capable of multitasking, thank you very much. You want to ensconce that human girl here, as she requested. I'm telling you it's fine. She is not to be in my lair or get in my way. She has permission to use the library so long as my rules are respected. Other than that, I don't care. Well, he said, that's a great relief. Thank you for being so accommodating, Imar. I will do my utmost to ensure this doesn't interfere with your pursuits. I'm not a Traximos or Iziroa, you know. I don't have strong feelings about mortals generally, for or against. My opinion about mortals is that they shouldn't bother me. If you start moving all your little bipedal friends into here, husband, we are going to have a problem, but one girl won't bother me so long as she follows the basic rules. Besides, my Fenurexa likes her, so I'm strongly motivated to approve. He blinked. Now wait a moment, you weren't even present during their conversation. Continuing to get along, are they? She glanced up at him with a faint smile. Good. Give me some basic credit for knowing my own daughter, husband. Remember how violently she bridled at the prospect of carrying you around, and then how willing she was to hoist that princess. Maybe it was the chanting star names, I'll admit I'm just a smidge curious about that myself, or maybe it's just because she's pretty. Whatever, Fenurexa needs life experiences. A friend apart from that insufferable wizard would be greatly to her benefit. It's not to the point I'm willing to evict her from the lair, but in recent years I've begun to worry. I have never known a dragon so averse to going outside and doing things. Except possibly her mother. Colin asked innocently. She looked up at him again, eyes narrowed in annoyance. Was that all you needed, Colin? I suppose so, he said with a heavy sigh. The needs of the moment call for me to backtrack all over this place having conversations with everybody. I was just indulging in being able to look at you and hear your voice for a bit longer. You are such a flirt. She scowled at him, ruining the effect by going bright pink in the cheeks. All right, go on. Be about your business, head of household. I am busy. Your wish is my command, my lady. I look forward eagerly to gazing upon your loveliness once. Out. She had turned her back now, but her ears were so bright red it seemed they should be steaming. Colin was grinning as he turned and departed the library. Nope, that still hadn't gotten old. Re-entering the central vault, he reached out with his mind to check the family's status. All three of his consorts were exactly where he'd left them last, and Fenurexa was still with Iziroa. Presumably Percy was with them. It was a funny thing, how quickly one could become accustomed to even the most bizarre developments. Here he was, finding himself worried about having someone around whom he couldn't instantly locate and diagnose in detail just by thinking about it, as if that were normal. And there were Vanamax and Vaidarelshi coming back. Together, Still, Colin had to wonder what had transpired out there. Vanomax taking a few minutes to cool off seemed like a good idea. He'd wondered momentarily if he wouldn't come back at all. This seemed like an opportune moment to try something he'd been wondering about. Extending his concentration, he focused on the presence of Izyroa, sensing the complex blend of her present emotions, amusement at something one of the girls was saying, a general warmth toward how well their discussion was going, liberally seasoned with carefully restrained fury at Vanomax and embarrassment at his actions. Nope. He knew he couldn't detect actual thoughts. It now turned out he couldn't transmit them, either. But concentrating, Colin managed to send something. It was just a little pulse of sorts, a brush of mental pressure. He instantly felt Izyroa go on the alert, turning her focus on him. Then she began to move, as did Fenurixa. Good. In fact, the timing was very good. She came trotting into the vault from the front entrance, looking particularly pleased with herself, and moments later Vanomax followed at a much more sedate pace, his head down and expression closed. At the same moment, the party emerged from his own quarters on the opposite end of the huge room. Colin gave Izyroa a smile in response to her questioning look, holding out a hand toward her. She glided forward to take it, Fenurixa meandering along behind and licking something off her claws, while Percy followed, clutching her skirts in both hands and looking nervous. The trio arrived at the head of the stairs, where Colin had gone to extend his senses, just as She and Vanomax had made it about halfway toward them. Both dragons stopped, falling still under Izyroa's suddenly cold stare. Good, everyone's here, Colin said. Well, everyone with whom I haven't already had this discussion individually, anyway. Princess Perseverance, I am glad to inform you that I've resolved my last lingering concerns and verified that there will be no objection to your presence. While I don't speak for Revkabit as you initially requested, I am willing to offer you asylum here, or I suppose, since we're not much of a political entity as such, simply our hospitality. She drew in a deep breath, and executed that formal-looking dipping motion again. Thank you very much, Monsieur Zelkhar. Zelkhar, Fenurixa corrected. Anyway, you can just call him Colin. Or Mr. Pants. She said brightly. Perseverance blinked thrice in rapid succession, looking as if her mind had just been brought to a complete halt trying to process that. Anyway, Colin continued with a sigh, you're our guest, Percy, not a prisoner. I'll do everything possible to make you comfortable, but I may have to ask for some patience at first while I somehow acquire the means to do that. We're, not really set up for hosting mortal guests. Yes, you mentioned that, she said. I will not get in the way or make any complaints. I'm very grateful for all of this. And of course, you will be welcome here as long as you need a place to stay. Should you decide to return home, or wish to go anywhere else, for that matter, we'll make it happen. Just let me know what you need, Percy. You know that much at least. Of course, yes, thank you, she said, nodding earnestly. I'm sorry, I am running out of pleasantries. People don't usually talk to me this much. Fenurixa grinned and Izyroa looked rueful. Colin decided that was a good cue to take the focus off Percy for the moment. Turning to face the other dragons, he continued. Everyone in this household needs to keep in mind that humans are fragile, at least compared to what you're used to. Please be careful where you step, and if you find need to interact with Her Highness, be as gentle as you possibly can. In fact, it's probably best if you refrain from touching her at all, particularly in larger forms. I don't think I like how you looked directly at me while you said that part, she complained. Yes, well, I've met you. Oh, nice. That's great, Pants. You really think I'm just some meathead, don't you? I want you to think back over our interactions thus far. All of them. Really ponder these exchanges, and then name me a single one that you think would have given me an impression other than that. She stared at him, jaws hanging agape. Venomax peered at her sidelong, visibly trying to conceal his own amusement. After a second, she shut her mouth with an audible snap. "Pants, I'm gonna need you to desist being right. It is very annoying." "Not the first time I've heard that. Percy, I think the best place for you to set up some sleeping quarters would be in my chamber." "Oh," she said, suddenly nervous. "Relax," Colin said gently, smiling. "Thanks to the magical wards, I have a high degree of control over the physical arrangements in there. I need to make better arrangements anyway. I've just been sleeping in Atraximos's museum, which is not fantastic for a host of reasons. There should be a way for me to subdivide the space, or at least put up barriers and screens, and it's certainly big enough to have sleeping areas far apart. I'll find a way to arrange a private space for you and make it as comfortable as possible." "Oh." She looked relieved enough to be curious again, at least. "And? Wards can do that? I thought those were just for detecting intruders." "It's the most basic function of a ward network," Phenorexa explained. "But in the end, it's a type of control magic tied to a discrete physical area. With more time, attention, and power, you can design it to do all kinds of things. Atraximos spent a long time on this one. I gather it's quite sophisticated. And Colin has control of it now, don't worry." "Phenorexa can show you around," Colin said. "Let's see. That door over there goes to the library. Imaralafine said you may use it, so long as you follow all the rules, which Phenorexa can also explain. The other three large doors on that level go to private lairs, and I'd recommend you stay out of them for now. That one specifically is Imaralafine's, and she has said in so many words that she wants no intruders. Best not risk it with the others unless they specifically tell you otherwise." "Yes, definitely," Percy said emphatically, nodding. "There are other corridors and things. I haven't even explored most of it yet. I think I've only seen the baths." "There are baths. Pretty nice ones, too." "In fact, that sounds like an excellent place to begin a tour." Isaro's voice was even and cool, but her golden eyes were fixed upon her son with an intensity that Colin could feel almost physically even without being directly in the line of her gaze. "Phenorexa, as you two seem to have hit it off so well, kindly take a few minutes to show our new guest the complex. I now have another matter to address." Venomax physically wilted, letting both his head and wings droop. Then, seeming to catch himself, he deliberately raised both, managing to look, if not proud, at least relatively poised. She edged delicately away from him. Percy blinked again, rapidly glancing between Colin and the various dragons. "What if—" "Shh." Phenorexa gently steered her away with a claw against her back. "Plenty of time to chat more with everyone later. That's all we have around here, time to chat. Right now let's go be in a different room." "Oh, that was a hint. I apologize, I'm bad at those." "You'll do just fine here. We don't go for subtlety in this joint." Isiro began to pull her hand from Colin's, taking the first step toward Venomax, and Colin was suddenly seized by a strange certainty that compelled him to take an action he had just specifically decided not to. "Roa!" He tightened his fingers on her claws, stopping her movement, and she turned her golden stare on him. Colin lowered his voice to be just barely audible to her and not the dragons below. "Go easy on him." Isiro's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. This time the anger was at least partially at him, the first time he'd ever been its direct recipient. It was intimidating on multiple powerful levels, and more to the point, Colin was suddenly unsure on rational grounds what the hells he was doing. Yet he met her gaze, refusing to retreat or flinch. "Husband." There was steel and ice in her tone, and a fire carefully banked for later. "You are awarded many privileges here, and over me personally, but your intervention in my raising of my son is not welcome." "Yes, I very much agree with that," Colin said, nodding earnestly. "Which is why I haven't said anything up till now, despite no, Venomax in general. Believe me, I don't want to get in the middle of this, but it's important. And you have somehow concluded that you are proficient in the raising of children? Of dragon children, in particular. He was raised, was the problem. Venomax was physically an adult dragon. He was a great-great-grandpa in human age. The fact that he was so immature. Nope, that was definitely not the right thing to say here. What are you planning to do, exactly? He asked instead, still keeping his voice discreetly quiet. She answered in a much less circumspect tone, audible enough to make Venomax flinch and lower his head clear across the room. This really is quite simple. The boy clearly needs a reminder where his boundaries lie, and the consequences of crossing them. That was when Colin caught up with himself, when he finally parsed consciously why he'd felt such a compulsion to step in here. Vindication, however, was not reassurance. His instinct had been right. He needed to lay this out in so many words, but gods uncounted, this was not going to go well. The errors in judgment Venomax has made recently all reflect his father's philosophy that might make right. Beating him down again will only reinforce that. Colin. The warning in her voice now was beyond clear. Her vocal control was sufficient to express that this would be the last warning. Gods help him, he wanted to drop it. But gods help him, he was right. Can you explain why I'm wrong? He asked in the same quiet tone. It is incredibly uncomfortable to me to be challenging you on this, Isaiah. I would love to be wrong. Just tell me why and I'll be happy to drop it forever. She bared her teeth, and he had a vivid thought that it was not the expression of a woman running out of patience with her husband, but a predator eyeballing his throat. All of you clobber the kids for every little thing, he continued when she failed to provide a rebuttal. I've been wondering for a while what that's meant to accomplish, since they always seem to need it again an hour later. Do not compare my rearing of my son with that of anyone else, she hissed. Especially them. This was going more or less the way he'd expected. Colin wanted desperately, more than anything in the world at that moment, to backtrack and leverage every iota of silver-tongued skill he possessed to smooth this over. To apologize, reassure her she was right, and then stay out of her business. But she wasn't right, and not only could he no longer avoid seeing it, but this was going to continue being a problem if someone didn't get through to Venomax. That's fair, he agreed quietly. Damn it all. Well, here it was. There really isn't much of a comparison. Both of them I can see being a reflection of their mother's tutelage. But Venomax doesn't reflect you at all. You understand social and political intricacies better than probably anyone else on this continent. How did your son end up with only his father's? Her claw was jerked from his grasp at her abrupt transformation. Colin was forced to step rapidly backward from the full-sized dragon he was suddenly facing. Isaiah whipped her neck around to glare at him from barely a pace away, opened her jaws and hissed ferociously. Hells uncounted, that was bad enough when Fenor exited it that close. She was more than twice the size. She could swallow him without chewing. He could see right down her throat into the glow of burning destruction that she obviously wanted to unleash in that moment. She turned so rapidly he had to duck under her tail. It would, of course, have bounced off him like a time-stone pillar, but in that moment, Colin really did not want to add any further insults to his tally. He already had no idea how he was going to recover from this debacle. Isaiah stormed toward the front exit. Venomax ducked his head further at her approach, while she backed up rapidly until she was squished into the far corner. Mother! She whipped her head at him and snapped her jaws hard enough to echo powerfully through the whole chamber. And then she was gone, her claws grating on the time-stone as she raked it furiously on her way out. None of them dared move until they heard the distant whoosh of enormous wings beating, and then fading into the distance. Damn, Colin, she said quietly. About sums it up, yeah, he agreed. Venomax was left standing there, looking confused and so disheartened that Colin couldn't help but feel for him, despite what a general menace he'd been lately. Well, this still had to be addressed, and apparently nobody else was going to. He flashed across the room directly toward Venomax, reappearing just outside of clawing range. The young dragon twisted his head around to stare at him. It was certainly not a friendly expression, but less aggressive than Colin would have expected. "So, Percy's nice," he said. Venomax narrowed his eyes, then snorted. Turning, he began pacing around Colin toward his mother's currently unoccupied chamber. Colin flexed his mind and lifted him bodily off the ground, then held him in midair. For a moment Venomax thrashed, first scrabbling for the floor with his talons, then beating his wings in an attempt to move himself the way he normally did when aloft. Obviously, none of this had any effect. Colin kept him firmly fixed in one spot, with a momentary exception of rotating him until they were again face to face. Based on previous experience he'd expected no end of raging at this, but Venomax appeared to have worked at least something out of his system. His expression was long-suffering and disgruntled, and otherwise he just hung there limply, like a wet cat. Only his tail was able to reach the ground, and he just let it lie there, the tip rhythmically tapping the floor in weary annoyance. "Actually, she's a little awkward," Colin continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. "Not at all what I'd have expected from royalty. But she's pleasant, very earnest, I would say. An easy person to like, even if she seems to have a bit of trouble figuring out how to express herself. If anything, it's kind of charming. Phenoraxis seems to get along with her well. I have to say, I wasn't expecting that." Venomax stared at him. "I get the impression her situation at home is very complicated," Colin continued seriously. "She is very fond of her family, I can tell she's going to miss them, and apparently they will her, as well. She's upset that they probably think she's dead, because they will grieve it the way anyone would their daughter. But evidently her presence created political complications for Boisford and her absence will make things smoother for them. I don't understand enough about the local politics to even guess how that works, all I know is it must have been a real challenge for her to live with. That takes a lot of character, you know. To put yourself in a situation like this, because it's what's best for your family. Even if it hurts them, and you. I definitely don't grasp the situation enough to know whether this is the right choice on her part, but I deeply respect the courage it must have taken. Especially when it means living with a bunch of dragons." "What are you doing?" Venomax demanded. "Disciplining you. I want you to understand the consequences of your actions. What you have done to the thinking, feeling person you decided to make a toy in whatever you were trying to accomplish. And to the others who have been affected by this." The dragon bared fangs at him. "You think I care for the feelings of some human? In a few decades she'll be gone and there'll be a bunch of others. That is the lot of your kind. You expect the likes of us to become invested in every insect that buzzes across our path. Dragons like treasure, right?" Colin said with a thin smile. "Tell me, what is it that makes things valuable? Based on the hoards I've seen thus far, shiny is one desirable trait, but probably the least compelling one. Mostly, it seems to come down to rarity. How unique a thing it is, and how difficult to replace." "What in all the hells are you blathering about?" Venomax exclaimed. "I am making a point, that you level creatures should understand that a life is more precious, not less, because it is brief and fragile." Venomax stared at him, mouth slightly open in apparent stupefaction. "Your father would have disagreed with me, of course," Colin said, watching him closely. "Perhaps you were more inclined to honor his perspective?" At that, finally, his captive began squirming, baring fangs and clearly trying to claw his way through the air at Colin. Good. He was getting somewhere. "It's not a good feeling, is it?" he said aloud. "Being held there, completely helpless at the whim of a power utterly beyond you." Venomax snarled and snapped his jaws at him. "What do you think it was like, living under the very shadow of Atraximos? Since you are so eager to invoke him, think for 1 second about what that means. You think I don't know what helplessness feels like? I've lived for a century in the constant fear of provoking a selfish, brutal creature who could peel me like a banana. And you presume, you dare to lecture me about helplessness. Compared to him, you and all your tricks are nothing. Well, see, that's the thing I'm having the hardest time understanding, Colin said, making his quiet voice a counterpoint to the dragon's fury. You know that and hate it so much. So how could you be so willing to inflict that on someone who's done you no wrong? This was the real moment of truth, the place where he feared it would all go wrong. Disdain and more bluster from Vanamax at this point would mean he had a real problem on his hands, one he had no idea how to go about fixing. But the worst did not happen. Vanamax jerked his head physically back as if Colin had punched his nose. He watched the dragon's incredulous expression twist through realization, then shame. He could only hold Colin's stare for another 2 heartbeats before it became too much to bear, and he first lowered his eyes, then twisted his head away entirely to stare at the floor. And it told Colin that he wasn't wasting his time here. Not that he was getting anywhere, necessarily, but that it was worth trying. That whatever issues Vanamax had, of which there were surely a lot, there was still a feeling heart in him. Someone who could understand the pain of others, in a way that mattered. Everything else could come with time, and effort, and practice. For now, Colin let him down. And then frowned, suddenly raising his head as he was suddenly distracted by a new sensation. Why do I smell wood smoke? Daryl, she coughed. Oh. That's a funny story. Tobe continued,